In the previous video, after an arranged marriage to Theodore Blake, Isabelle found a new life at the Blake mansion. Despite the loneliness and emotional burden, she formed a caring relationship with her mother-in-law Clarissa and found purpose in becoming pregnant with triplets through artificial insemination. Months passed, and Isabelle gave birth to the babies, bringing joy to the family. But everything changed when, on the triplets' 3-month anniversary, Theodore woke up from his coma. Confused and incredulous, he discovered that he was married to a woman he didn't know and was the father of 3 children. Disgusted by his parents' decision, he rejected Isabelle and the children, creating a chasm between them and destroying any hope Isabelle had of finally belonging to a family. Now Isabelle will have to deal with the weight of this rejection and decide what to do to protect herself and her children. The silence in the room was suffocating. Theodore was still sitting on the bed, his eyes wide, switching between Isabelle, Clarissa, Richard, and the baby Isabelle was holding. It was as if the world around him was spinning too fast for him to keep up. "Married," he repeated, his voice hoarse and full of disbelief. "And children?" Isabelle nodded slowly, trying to stay calm but feeling her heart race. "Yes," she said softly, looking down at the baby in her arms. "Triplets. They were born 3 months ago." Theodore ran his hand through his hair, still confused. He seemed to be trying to put together the pieces of a puzzle that didn't make sense. "How did this happen?" He looked at his parents, anger growing in his voice. "How did you allow this?" Clarissa stepped forward, her hands raised in a conciliatory gesture. "Theodore, darling, you were in a coma. We were trying to do what was best for you, for the family." "For the family," he interrupted, his voice rising. "I wake up and suddenly I have a wife and 3 children. Is that what you call doing the best?" Richard intervened, trying to keep his composure. "It wasn't an easy decision, but Isabelle was a devoted companion. She looked after you. She was by your side all this time." Theodore glanced at Isabelle, but there was no gratitude in his eyes, just frustration and worse, rejection. "And what about you?" he asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Why did you accept this? Did you agree to marry a man in a coma? Did you accept having children from someone you don't even know?" Isabelle felt her face burn. Every word was like a blow. She wanted to answer. She wanted to say that she had had no choice, but her voice failed her. "Have you no dignity?" Theodore continued without holding back. "How could you agree to something like that?" "Theodore," Clarissa scolded him, horrified by the way he spoke. Isabelle swallowed, holding the baby closer to her as if it could protect her from the pain. She tried to speak, but the tears threatened to fall. "I just wanted to do what was right." Theodore let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Right for who? For my parents? For you? Because it certainly wasn't right for me." He looked at his parents again, pointing at Isabelle and the babies. "This is a life you've created for me, but I didn't ask for it. I won't accept it." Clarissa took another step forward, taking his arm. "Theodore, please don't make rash decisions. Think about the babies. Think about what this means for all of us." He pulled his arm free of his mother's touch. "I didn't ask for any of this, Mom," he said, his voice now firmer. "I appreciate the care and attention, but I'm not going to live this ridiculous life you've set up." He turned to Isabelle, his eyes still full of anger. "I don't know you, I don't love you, and I definitely don't want to be married to you." Those words were the last straw for Isabelle. She felt the ground disappear from under her feet. Each word seemed to tear pieces out of her heart. "Theodore?" She tried, but he held up his hand to interrupt her. "I'm going to find a lawyer," he declared, ignoring his parents' shocked looks. "I'm going to break up this marriage as soon as possible. And about the babies." He looked at the cribs where the other 2 were sleeping. "That's something you'll have to sort out. I'm not ready to be a father, especially under these circumstances." Clarissa was stunned, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Theodore, that's cruel." "Cruel?" He laughed again, but the sound was hollow. "Cruel is what you did to me." He got out of bed with difficulty, still weak, and headed for the bathroom, closing the door tightly. The room fell silent. Isabelle was still standing by the cribs, her eyes watery, holding her baby tightly to her chest. Clarissa approached, desperate. "Isabelle," she began, her voice soft but full of concern. Isabelle shook her head, her eyes full of tears. "I can't stay here, Clarissa. He doesn't want me here. He doesn't want any of this." Clarissa held her arm. "Please, Isabelle, don't make a decision now. He's confused. He'll change his mind." Isabelle looked at her, feeling the weight of yet another rejection in her life. "He's not going to change, Clarissa, and I can't stay here knowing that I'm rejected." She picked up the 2 babies in the crib and cradled them in her arms, along with the 3rd. "I know it's going to be hard, especially now that I have them, but I have to go." Clarissa tried to argue again, but stopped when she saw the determination in Isabelle's eyes. "If that's what you think you need to do." Clarissa took a deep breath, visibly shaken. "Call me tomorrow, please. I want to know where you are. I want to help." Isabelle nodded, clutching her children to her. "Thank you, Clarissa." She left the mansion without looking back, with the triplets in her arms and a broken heart. Every step she took seemed heavier, but she knew she had to keep going. For the first time, she was leaving not out of weakness, but because she knew she couldn't accept less than she deserved. Isabelle was walking down the street with the triplets in her arms and a suitcase slung over her shoulder. The sky was overcast, and the cold wind cut across her face, but none of this seemed to matter. Every step was heavy, and she had only one thing on her mind: finding somewhere she could go. She thought about calling Clarissa, but pride and pain wouldn't allow it. Isabelle knew she would be welcomed, but she couldn't bear the thought of going back to the mansion and facing more rejection. Her heart was still broken by Theodore's words, echoing in her mind like a cruel sentence. "I don't know you, I don't love you, and I don't want to be married to you." She took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears as she looked at her children's little faces. They were restless but still calm in her arms. "I'll manage," she whispered to them, although she wasn't sure she believed her own words. After some time walking, Isabelle made a decision. She didn't have many options. She would go back to her parents' house. When she reached the Morgan mansion, Isabelle hesitated for a moment before ringing the doorbell. It was strange to be back there after everything. Part of her knew that Francis would hardly welcome her, but she had no other choice. The door was opened by William. He was surprised to see Isabelle, the triplets, and the suitcase. "Isabelle, what's happened?" Just the tone of concern in his voice was enough to make her crumble. Tears began to fall as she tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled. "Dad, I didn't know where to go. He kicked me out of his life. He doesn't want me, and deep down he's right. I'm a stranger." William looked at his grandchildren, who were beginning to grumble, and then back at Isabelle. "Come in," he said gently, making way for her to pass. Isabelle entered with difficulty, the weight of the children and the suitcase beginning to tire her. William closed the door and guided her into the living room. "Have a seat. I'll get you some water." She nodded, trying to pull herself together as she sat down on the sofa. The children began to fuss, and Isabelle gently placed them on a blanket on the sofa, making sure they were comfortable. When William returned with the water, Isabelle began to tell him everything that had happened, her voice shaking with every word. Theodore woke up. He was so angry. He said he would never love me, that he wanted nothing to do with me or the children. She sniffled, clutching her glass of water with trembling hands. "I couldn't stay there. Not after what he said." William sat next to her, listening intently. He looked sad but not surprised. "I'm sorry this happened, Isabelle, but you did what you thought was right. You always have, and I'll be here for you, okay?" Isabelle nodded, but her heart was still heavy. Hours later, while Isabelle was in her nursery trying to get the triplets to sleep, the front door burst open. The sound echoed through the house, and she knew immediately that Francis had arrived. "William!" Francis' loud, impatient voice filled the hallway. Isabelle felt her stomach tighten. It wasn't long before she heard Francis's footsteps coming up the stairs. She was on her way to her room. Isabelle took a deep breath, preparing herself to face her, but Francis walked straight past and into her and William's room. A few minutes later, Isabelle heard the argument begin. "What is it, William?" Francis asked, her voice laced with irritation. "Why is Isabelle here?" "She needed help," William replied, trying to keep his tone calm. "Help?" Francis laughed, but it sounded bitter. When I needed help, where was she? She humiliated me, she refused to help. And now she turns up here with nothing, with 3 children, expecting what? For us to take care of her? Frances, please, keep your voice down. William tried to calm her down. Let's not discuss it like this. I'll speak as I like, Frances retorted, getting more and more worked up. Isabelle has nothing to do with this family. She didn't help when I needed her, but now she wants us to support her. No, she's no longer our responsibility. In the hallway, Isabelle felt her chest tighten as she heard her mother's words. Tears began to flow before she could stop them. Frances, she had nowhere else to go. She's our daughter. She's not our daughter, Frances shouted without thinking. The silence that followed was deafening. William stood motionless, his eyes wide, while Frances seemed to realize too late what she had just said. Isabelle, who was standing in the doorway, listening to everything, felt as if the world had stopped. What? Shut up. Keep your voice down. Nobody needs to know about this, William asked, his voice almost inaudible. Frances let out a heavy sigh, as if she had been carrying that secret for a long time. Isabelle is not our daughter. She never was, and it's high time she knew that. William shook his head in disbelief. How can you say something like that? Because it's the truth, and I've always wanted to tell her. You never let me. Frances crossed her arms, her face still hard. She's not our blood like Olivia. At the door, Isabelle let out a sob. They both turned at the same time, seeing her standing there, her eyes full of tears. Isabelle, William began, but she was already backing away. So that's it? She whispered, her voice breaking. I'm not your daughter. William tried to move closer, but she held up her hand, asking him to stop. I get it, Isabelle said, tears flowing freely. I don't belong anywhere, do I? Neither here nor there. She went back to her room quickly, picked up the triplets, who were still drowsy, and the suitcase she hadn't even unpacked. William tried to follow her, but when he reached the corridor, he saw Isabelle already coming down the stairs with the babies in her arms. Isabelle, please don't go, he begged. She paused for a moment in the doorway without turning around. I thought I could find some peace here, but you've reminded me that I never really had a home. Daughter, William began, but she interrupted him. Don't call me that, she said, her voice laden with pain. Not after what I've just heard. She opened the door, taking one last look at the house before leaving. I don't know where I'm going, but I'm not staying where I'm not wanted. And with that, Isabelle left, disappearing into the darkness of the night with the triplets and stopping in the town's main square. The night was cold and silent in the square, except for the distant sound of passing cars. Isabelle was sitting on a wooden bench, holding the triplets in her arms, trying to warm them with what little she had. They slept, oblivious to the chaos their mother was facing, while she cried silently. The tears fell uncontrollably, leaving trails down her pale face. Isabelle looked up at the sky, covered in clouds that hid the stars. She felt as empty and insignificant as that dark sky. Why? She whispered, the sound of her voice almost lost in the night. Holding her children tighter, Isabelle shook her head, feeling crushed by the weight of loneliness. Why does it have to be so hard? She asked the wind, her voice laced with pain. Why with me? She thought of everything she had faced. A childhood of rejection, a lifetime of being compared to her sister, a forced marriage, and now the revelation that she wasn't even the daughter of parents who no longer loved her. I was never enough, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Not for my mother, not for Theodore, not for anyone. The tears continued to flow as Isabelle felt the weight of her existence. She looked at the triplets, their small hands clutching the blankets, and a sob escaped her lips. I just wanted someone to love me. Her voice failed, broken by pain. I just wanted to be important to someone. She leaned back against the bench, the babies nestled in her arms, and let tiredness overwhelm her. Isabelle closed her eyes, tears still flowing, and fell asleep right there in the street under the indifferent sky. The morning arrived cold and grey, and Isabelle was woken by the insistent sound of her cell phone vibrating in her bag. She blinked a few times, trying to remember where she was, until reality hit her like a blow. She looked around, seeing the movement of people coming and going in the square, some casting curious glances at her. Carefully, She adjusted the triplets, who were still sleeping, and picked up her cell phone. Clarissa's name flashed on the screen. She answered, her voice still hoarse and trembling with tiredness. "Hello? Isabelle?" Clarissa's voice was full of relief and concern. "I've been trying to reach you since yesterday. Where are you?" Isabelle hesitated, feeling the knot in her throat grow again. "In the square. I slept here." The silence on the other end of the line was overwhelming. "What?" Clarissa finally managed to say, her voice incredulous. "You slept in the street with the babies." "I had nowhere else to go," Isabelle replied, her voice low and embarrassed. Clarissa was silent for a moment, but Isabelle could hear her breathing quicken. "Tell me where you are. Which square?" "Now. I'm coming to get you." Before Isabelle could protest, Clarissa hung up. A short while later, Clarissa arrived at the square in her car. When she saw Isabelle sitting on the bench with the triplets in her arms and her suitcase by her side, her heart broke. She quickly got out of the car and ran over to them. "Isabelle," Clarissa began, but her voice failed her when she saw the young woman's condition. Isabelle was pale with deep circles under her eyes and her eyes swollen from crying. "I'm so sorry," Isabelle said immediately, the tears starting to fall again. "I didn't know where to go." Clarissa knelt down beside her, putting her hands on Isabelle's shoulders. "Don't apologize," Clarissa said firmly. "You shouldn't be going through this." She looked at the babies, who were now slowly waking up, and sighed deeply. "Let's go. You can't stay here." Clarissa helped Isabelle put the babies in the car, picking up the suitcase and putting it in the trunk. When they were in the car, Isabelle finally began to tell them what had happened at her parents' house. "I found out that—" Isabelle stopped, trying to control her crying. "That I'm not their daughter." Clarissa turned to her, shocked. "What?" Francis said. Isabelle continued, her voice breaking. "She shouted at my father that I'm not their daughter. I heard everything." Clarissa couldn't hide her indignant expression. How could she do that? Isabelle shook her head, her eyes watering. "I don't know. But it all makes sense now. Why she never liked me, why she always preferred Olivia." Clarissa held her hand as she drove. "Isabelle, you didn't deserve this. No matter where you come from, you're an incredible person. And a wonderful mother." Isabelle swallowed, trying to believe Clarissa's words. Clarissa took Isabelle to a simple but comfortable hotel, making sure that she and the babies had a safe place to stay. "You're staying here until we find an apartment for you," Clarissa said, helping Isabelle take her suitcase and the babies up to her room. "I'm not leaving you, Isabelle, not you, not my grandchildren." "Clarissa, I don't know how to thank you," Isabelle said, feeling emotional. "No need to thank me," Clarissa replied with a smile. "Just promise you'll accept my help." Isabelle nodded, holding back tears as she watched Clarissa set up the makeshift cribs for the triplets. Over the next few days, Clarissa started looking for apartments for Isabelle while keeping it a secret from Richard and Theodore. She knew they wouldn't understand her decision, but she was determined to do the right thing. Finally, she found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It was simple, but cozy. Clarissa helped Isabelle move in, bringing basic furniture and making sure she had everything she needed to get started. "This is temporary," Clarissa said, holding Isabelle's hands. "You'll get back on your feet, and I'll be here to help in any way I can." "I promise I'll repay you for all this," Isabelle said, overwhelmed. "As soon as I can, I'll get to work and return every penny." Clarissa smiled, stroking Isabelle's cheek. "I believe in you, darling." Meanwhile, at the Blake mansion, Theodore was completely recovered physically, but emotionally he was still lost. He spent his nights going out to bars and parties, trying to escape the new reality he had rejected. Richard tried to talk to him, asking him to reevaluate his choices. "You have a family now, Theodore. You should give them a chance." But Theodore just shook his head, irritated. "I didn't ask for this family. You invented it, now take it on." Richard sighed in frustration as he watched his son drift further and further away. The nights at the Blake mansion had become a repetitive and heartbreaking cycle. Every time Theodore left, the house was silent. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that was accompanied by worry and pain. Clarissa watched the clock in the living room every night, waiting for Theodore to return, but he never arrived before dawn. When he finally came through the door, the sun was already high in the sky, and his image was always the same: sloppy clothes, red eyes, a strong smell of alcohol and cheap perfume. Almost always he had a different woman by his side, laughing or trying to keep her balance as he climbed the stairs to his room. Clarissa sat on the edge of the sofa, clasping her hands in her lap, her heart squeezing at the sight of her son destroying himself like that. Richard, for his part, watched everything in silence, but his patience was wearing thin. "Theodore, you've got to stop this," Richard said one morning, after waiting for his son to come down for coffee. Theodore was sitting at the table, grumpy, stirring his coffee as if it were a punishment to be there. He looked up at his father, his expression showing clear disinterest. "Stop what?" "That," Richard replied, pointing at him. "The parties, the women, this aimless life." Theodore laughed, but the sound was hollow. "I'm just enjoying life. After all, you gave me a life I didn't choose. Now I choose how to live it." Richard slammed his hand on the table, his patience wearing thin. "This is selfish, Theodore. You're acting as if nothing matters. What about the companies? You should be helping to maintain the family legacy." Theodore shrugged. "You're taking very good care of it yourself. You don't need me." Clarissa, who was sitting quietly next to him, felt tears threaten to fall. She had recovered her son, but the man in front of her didn't look like the same Theodore she had known before the accident. "Theodore, please," she said softly, trying to contain the emotion in her voice. "I'm grateful every day to have you back, but this isn't life." Theodore looked at his mother for a moment, and for a moment, Clarissa thought that her words had touched something in him. But then he looked away, getting up from the table. "I have to leave." Without saying another word, Theodore took the car keys and walked out the door, leaving Clarissa heartbroken once again. Meanwhile, in a small, modest apartment, Isabelle's life followed a completely different rhythm. The morning started early with the triplets' cries waking her up before the sun had even risen. She barely had time to breathe before starting the routine of changing diapers, preparing bottles, and calming the three little ones, who seemed to compete to see who would demand the most attention. It was exhausting. Isabelle spent whole days without a break, and the nights were just as hectic. But despite everything, she felt something she had never felt before: true love. When she held her children in her arms, when she saw their little faces light up with a smile, she felt a warmth that filled the emptiness she had been carrying for so long. "You are everything to me," she said softly, as she rocked one of them to sleep. Even on the hardest days when tiredness seemed unbearable, Isabelle found strength in them. For the first time in her life, she knew what it was like to be truly loved. In moments of tranquility, when the triplets finally fell asleep, Isabelle went back to studying. At the small kitchen table, with a battered notebook and a few books borrowed from the local library and the internet, she immersed herself in the world of investments. It was a habit that had started at the Blake mansion, when she would explore the library in search of something to occupy her mind. Now, studying finance was more than a distraction. It was a way of building a future for herself and her children. Isabelle used some of the money Clarissa gave her to invest in the financial market. She was careful, analyzing each step carefully, and little by little she began to see results. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her a glimmer of hope. "One day I'm going to be somebody," she murmured to herself as she jotted down strategies in her notebook. She didn't want to depend on Clarissa's generosity forever. She wanted to give back everything she had received. Clarissa, for her part, continued to help Isabelle in secret. Every week, she visited Isabelle in her apartment, bringing supplies, clothes for the babies, and money for expenses. Richard didn't know, and neither did Theodore. Clarissa knew that they wouldn't understand her decision, but for her, Isabelle and the triplets were part of the family, and she would do anything to ensure that they had a decent life. "You are a blessing in my life," Isabelle said, holding Clarissa's hands during one of her visits. Clarissa smiled, her eyes watering. "No, darling. You're a blessing in my life. You gave me grandchildren and showed me what it really means to care for someone." While Isabelle slowly built her new life, Theodore continued his spiral of self-destruction. He went out every night, drinking late and surrounding himself with people he barely knew. He tried to fill the emptiness he felt, But nothing seemed to be enough. Clarissa watched her son drift further and further away, her heart heavy with the pain of seeing him throw away the second chance he had been given. One night, after Theodore had left for another party, Clarissa went to his room. The place was a mess, with clothes strewn across the floor and empty bottles on the tables. She picked up a framed photo that was lying in a corner. It was an old photo of Theodore before the accident, smiling next to Richard and Clarissa. "What happened to you, my son?" Clarissa whispered, holding the photo against her chest. While Theodore was sinking, Isabelle was being reborn. Between diapers, bottles, and studies, she began to build a solid foundation for the future. With every small improvement in her investments, with every smile from her children, Isabelle felt that she was on the right track. She knew the journey would be long and difficult, but for the first time, she had something to fight for. And above all, she had love. The months that followed brought a series of devastating events for the Blake family. It all started with Richard's health, which, already under pressure from business responsibilities, began to deteriorate. He had constant chest pains and suffered from extreme tiredness, but refused to rest, determined to keep the business running. But one day, during an important meeting at the company's headquarters, Richard felt pain so intense that he could hardly breathe. He was rushed to hospital, where doctors confirmed that he had suffered a heart attack. Clarissa stayed by her husband's side throughout, but the diagnosis was not promising. Richard needed absolute rest and could not continue to run the business. This meant that for the first time Theodore would be asked to take over. When Clarissa looked for Theodore to talk about the situation, she found him in his room, packing for another of his trips. "Theodore, we need to talk." Clarissa began, trying to stay calm. Theodore didn't even look at her as he folded his clothes. "About what?" "About the company." Clarissa replied, her voice firmer. "Your father is in hospital. He can't take care of everything anymore. It's time for you to take responsibility." Theodore laughed, but the sound was cold and humorless. "Responsibility? Isn't that what he said when he decided to set up a life for me without my permission?" Clarissa was silent for a moment, swallowing the pain of her son's words. "This isn't about the past, Theodore. It's about the present," she insisted. "Business is falling apart. We're losing contracts, clients. If you don't do something now, it will be too late." "Then let it collapse," Theodore said dismissively. "I never wanted any of this, Mom. And if the company can't survive without me, then maybe it doesn't deserve to exist." Clarissa felt a wave of despair. "Theodore, for God's sake, this company is your father's legacy, our family. And it's not just about us. There are hundreds of employees who depend on it, and the money you use and spend on your parties comes from the company you don't want to help." Theodore sighed, closing his suitcase tightly. "I'm not going to change my life because of this." "Change your life?" Clarissa asked, incredulous. "Theodore, your life now is drinking, traveling, and spending money. Don't you realize what's going on around you?" He laughed again, but this time there was anger in his voice. "No, Mom. What I realize is that you always try to control me. First, you arrange a marriage that I didn't ask for. Then you make me have children I didn't want. And now you expect me to save the company? No. In fact, I don't even believe you. For me, it's all theater, a lie, just another setup by you and Dad to control my life." Clarissa felt tears streaming down her face. "I just want you to have a decent life, Theodore. Do something good with this second chance you've been given." Theodore picked up his suitcase and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned to her with a bitter smile on his face. "Worthy for whom? For you? For Dad? For Isabelle? She, by the way, was the biggest fraud of all." Clarissa was speechless as she watched him leave once again. Meanwhile, at the company's headquarters, chaos was taking over. Without Richard to supervise, and with Theodore completely absent, important contracts were lost, production dropped, and the company's reputation began to plummet. To make matters worse, Theodore continued to withdraw large sums of money to finance his lavish lifestyle. Extravagant trips, parties, and women were financed with the company's money, while the debts piled up. When the news arrived that the Blake's mansion was to be seized by the bank, Clarissa felt the weight of years of dedication come crashing down on her. Now, the family only had a few more months to stay in the house before losing it for good. In the midst of all this, Richard's health took another turn for the worse. He was taken to hospital again, but this time the doctors were clear. His heart couldn't take much more. Clarissa spent days divided between the hospital, the mansion, and Isabelle's small apartment. Despite everything, she still made a point of visiting her daughter-in-law and grandchildren, finding some consolation in seeing them grow up healthy. "They are my joy," Clarissa said, holding one of the babies on her lap while Isabelle prepared dinner. "Even though everything is falling apart, they give me hope." Isabelle smiled, but felt the weight of her mother-in-law's words. "You've been an angel in my life, Clarissa," Isabelle replied. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Clarissa held Isabelle's hand, her eyes watering. "You're strong, Isabelle, and that's why you'll get through all this." A few weeks later, Richard couldn't resist. Clarissa held his hand as he took his last breath, and her world fell apart. She was left alone, without the husband who had been her foundation for so many years, and with a son who seemed to have no interest in helping or getting back on his feet. After the funeral, Clarissa tried once again to speak to Theodore. "Theodore, it's just the two of us now," she said, holding his hand. "I need you. The company needs you." Theodore pulled his hand away, his expression cold. "I'm nobody's savior, Mum." Clarissa felt anger rising inside her. "Do you have any idea how much this hurts me? To see what you've become?" "And whose fault is that?" Theodore retorted, his voice full of sarcasm. "You created all this. You made me this way." "No, Theodore," Clarissa replied firmly. "You're like this because you chose to be, because it's easier to run away than to face reality." Theodore didn't answer. He just got up and left once again, leaving Clarissa alone in the living room. While the Blake family fell apart, Isabelle moved on. Now with the triplets already a year old, she had managed to find balance in her life. Her routine was still tiring, but she had become a financial expert, offering online advice to various companies. Thanks to her determination and the time she had spent studying at the Blake mansion, Isabelle had managed to build up a solid clientele and was earning well. Enough to pay her expenses, invest more in the financial market, and ensure a better life for her children. She looked at them playing on the small rug in the living room, feeling a joy she had never known before. "You are my reason for everything," she said, smiling. Isabelle knew she still had a long way to go, but for the first time, she felt in control of her life. The last few months had been a test of resilience for Clarissa. She had lost Richard, the family business was sinking into debt, and Theodore continued to live irresponsibly, indifferent to the impending disaster. The mansion, which for decades had been the symbol of the Blakes' power and prosperity, was about to be taken over by the bank. Clarissa did what she could to maintain her dignity, but the weight of it all was unbearable. There was no more luxury, no more parties, no more of the pomp that once surrounded the Blake family. The silence inside the house was deafening, full of memories and regrets. Meanwhile, Theodore continued his routine of excess. He no longer had access to the same flow of money as before, and that made him even angrier. He spent his days away, returning to the mansion only to take what he needed and leave again. Clarissa, on the other hand, found small moments of joy in visiting Isabelle and her grandchildren. Even with everything falling apart around her, the purity and energy of the triplets brightened her days. One afternoon, Clarissa decided to visit Isabelle once again. She needed that dose of happiness that her grandchildren brought her, but she also carried in her chest the weight of the news that she had avoided sharing until then. When she arrived at the apartment, Isabelle opened the door with a warm smile. "Clarissa," she exclaimed, holding one of the triplets on her lap. "What a nice surprise." Clarissa smiled back, although her tired look gave away her sadness. "I needed to see you," she said, entering the apartment. The triplets ran up to their grandmother, laughing and babbling words they were still learning. Clarissa knelt down to hug them, feeling the momentary joy that only they could bring. Isabelle watched the scene for a moment, but soon realized that something was wrong. Clarissa looked more dejected than usual. "Clarissa, what happened?" Isabelle asked, sitting down next to her on the sofa. Clarissa sighed, running her hand through her grey hair as she tried to find the right words. "Isabelle, things are very bad." "What do you mean?" Clarissa looked at her grandchildren playing on the carpet and then back at Isabelle. "We're going to lose the mansion. The bank has given us a deadline to leave. There's nothing more we can do." Isabelle was silent for a few seconds, absorbing the information. "How did this happen?" she asked in disbelief. "You had so much—" Clarissa shook her head, her eyes watering. "Theodore happened. He destroyed everything. He took money from the company to finance that purposeless life, and when Richard got sick, no one was there to take care of the business. He let everything fall apart, Isabelle, and now we're on the verge of bankruptcy." Isabelle felt a mixture of shock and indignation. She couldn't believe that Theodore, even after everything he'd been through, could be so irresponsible. "Clarissa, this is unbelievable," Isabelle said, still processing what she had heard. "And Theodore, does he know what's going on?" "He doesn't care," Clarissa replied, her voice laden with pain. "He lives in his own world, as if none of this is his responsibility." Isabelle felt a wave of compassion for Clarissa. Despite everything that had happened, she had always been a devoted mother, a woman who tried to keep her family together, and now she was facing everything alone. She looked at Clarissa, who seemed so fragile, and knew at that moment what she needed to do. "Clarissa, you're not going to be left without a place to live," Isabelle said firmly. Clarissa looked at her in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean that it's time for me to repay you for everything you've done for me," Isabelle replied, holding Clarissa's hands. "I've been saving a lot and my investments have grown a lot. I'm earning more than enough to live well." Clarissa tried to protest, but Isabelle continued. "I'm moving to a bigger, more comfortable house, and I want you to come with me." Clarissa shook her head, the tears starting to flow. "Isabelle, I can't accept this. You already have so much to worry about." "You helped us when I had nothing, Clarissa," Isabelle said, her voice full of emotion. "Now it's my turn to help you. You can be close to the grandchildren and we can keep each other company." Clarissa looked at the triplets, who were playing happily on the carpet, and felt a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Isabelle," she began, but her voice failed her. "It's not a request, Clarissa, it's a decision." Clarissa finally gave in, hugging Isabelle tightly as the tears fell freely. "Thank you, Isabelle," she whispered. "Thank you for not leaving me alone." A few weeks later, Isabelle found a spacious house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't a mansion like the Blakes, but it was comfortable, elegant and perfect to house the new family she was building with Clarissa and the triplets. When they moved in, Clarissa felt as if a huge weight had been lifted off her shoulders. For the first time in months, she didn't have to worry about where she would sleep or how she would cope with the ruin of her old life. Isabelle, for her part, felt a deep sense of satisfaction at seeing Clarissa smiling again. She knew that what she was doing was more than an act of retribution. It was a way of building something new, something real. The triplets continued to be Clarissa's joy. Even on the hardest days, they were the light that kept her going. Meanwhile, Theodore remained lost in his own spiral of self-destruction. Without the company's money to finance his luxurious lifestyle, he began to realize what he had lost. But instead of taking responsibility, he blamed everyone around him. His parents, Isabelle, even the company itself. The news that Clarissa had moved in with Isabelle made him even angrier. "Of course," he said sarcastically. "Now she'll be treated like the family saint." But deep down, Theodore knew he was alone, and for the first time he began to feel the weight of his choices. A few years later, Theodore's fall was harder than he ever imagined. Without money, status, or support, he was abandoned by the people who had once surrounded him. The women who accompanied him to parties disappeared, the friends who laughed alongside him evaporated, and even the luxuries he took for granted turned into bitter memories. Now he found himself alone, facing the emptiness of the life he had built with his own choices. The Blake mansion was already a distant past. The company had gone bankrupt, and the family had lost almost everything. He knew that he had been the main culprit. With no alternative, Theodore began to look for Clarissa, trying to reconnect. On one of his visits to her new home, he knocked on the door, his countenance downcast. "Mom, I need help," he said, almost pleading. Clarissa looked at him sadly. Although she still loved him, she couldn't ignore what she saw, a man who was there, not out of genuine regret, but out of interest. "What do you want, Theodore?" she asked, crossing her arms. "I want to change, Mum. I want to get closer to Isabelle and the boys," he said, looking away. Clarissa sighed. "That's because you're alone now, isn't it? Because you've realized that you've lost everything." "That's not it." Theodore tried to justify it, but the hesitation in his voice was evident. Clarissa shook her head in disappointment. "Theodore, Isabelle has fought hard to get where she is, and she doesn't need you messing up her life again." "Mom, No." Clarissa interrupted him, her voice firm. "I won't let you hurt Isabelle and my grandchildren again. Not while I'm here." Without his mother's support and nowhere else to go, Theodore began to face harsh reality. He got a job as a waiter in a coffee shop, a place Clarissa had frequented in the past when she was still rich. The owner, a man who admired her former generosity, agreed to give Theodore a chance. At first, he hated every second of it. The customers treated him with indifference or contempt, and he spent hours on his feet clearing tables and serving orders, while remembering the life he had lost. But over time, something began to change. For the first time, Theodore understood the value of work, the weight of daily effort. He began to reflect on his choices, on how he had destroyed his own life and that of his family. Now, living in the old apartment that had once belonged to Isabelle, Theodore felt surrounded by memories. He walked around the small space, wondering how Isabelle had raised the triplets there, alone, while he wasted millions. I was an idiot. Meanwhile, Isabelle's life was taking a completely different path. She was experiencing a golden period in her career in the financial market. Her consultancies were in high demand, her investments had grown exponentially, and she was now one of the most successful women in the industry. It was at one of her networking events that she met Jonathan Carter, the CEO of a major investment firm. Jonathan was charming, polite, and intelligent. From their first meeting, he showed a genuine interest in Isabelle, not just because of her beauty, but because of her intelligence and determination. Before long, they were in a relationship. Jonathan was attentive and affectionate, something Isabelle had never experienced in a relationship. He also got on well with the triplets, which won her heart even more. One day, during a private dinner in an upscale restaurant, Jonathan knelt down in front of Isabelle, holding a small box with a diamond ring. "Isabelle Morgan, you are the most incredible woman I have ever met. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Isabelle felt tears welling up as she nodded, overcome with emotion. Yes. Now Isabelle lived like a millionaire, married to Jonathan, who treated her like a queen. They lived in a luxurious mansion, but what thrilled her most was the love she had finally found. Clarissa remained a constant presence in her life, dividing her time between Isabelle's house and the small apartment where Theodore lived. One day, Clarissa went to visit Theodore at the end of a long shift in the cafeteria. He looked exhausted, but there was something different about him. "Mom," he said, sitting down at the table with her. "I'm trying. I really am." Clarissa held his hands, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "I believe in you, Theodore," she replied, "but it takes more than effort to make amends for the past." Theodore nodded, looking more humble than ever. "I know. And even if Isabelle never forgives me, I want her to know that I regret everything." Meanwhile, Isabelle's family finally reappeared. Francis, William, and Olivia, who had disappeared when she was struggling to survive, heard about her success and her new marriage. Francis was the first to look for her, arriving at the mansion with a fake smile on her face. "Isabelle, darling, how are you? We heard about your wedding. How wonderful." Isabelle kept her posture, but her expression was cold. "What do you want, Francis?" Francis feigned offense but then changed her tune. "Can't we visit our daughter? You've never considered me your daughter before, and I understand why," Isabelle replied cuttingly. William tried to intervene. "Isabelle, we made a mistake, but we're here now. Now that I'm a millionaire," Isabelle added without hiding her bitterness. Olivia remained silent, clearly uncomfortable. Isabelle looked at her for a moment before continuing. "I've learned to live without you, and I will continue to do so." Francis tried to insist, but Isabelle interrupted her. "You can leave. With no choice, Francis and the others left, leaving Isabelle alone. A few months later, Isabelle was at home, playing with the triplets while Jonathan read a book on the sofa. Clarissa arrived to visit, bringing a cake she had baked. "How are my favorite grandchildren?" Clarissa asked, hugging the boys. As laughter filled the house, Isabelle felt a sense of peace she had never experienced before. On the other side of town, Theodore was closing his shift at the coffee shop. He was still a long way from fixing his life, but now he understood the value of effort and was willing to keep trying. Life had gone in completely different directions for everyone, but for Isabelle, the reward for everything she had faced had finally arrived. Love, stability, and a family she could call her own. So, what did you think of this exciting story full of twists and turns? We really want to know what you think. Leave us a rating from 0 to 10 for this story in the comments and tell us which part was your favorite. If you were rooting for Isabelle, let us know. Don't forget to leave a like to support the channel and subscribe by activating the bell so you don't miss any stories like this one. And of course, check out the next video that's already appearing here on the screen. You won't want to miss it. Just click. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.